The next question that we were asked during the break was, so Lorelei, you mentioned that you don't believe everything that Sitchin says, then why do you have him on the show? Well, for heaven's sakes, it doesn't mean I throw the whole thing out. I'm just saying that, I mean, he presents a lot of very intriguing arguments, and who's to know? Who's to know about any of this? So I find fascinating reading, and I think he makes numerous excellent points, and I'm no authority on this stuff, for heaven's sakes. I haven't sat there and translated Sumerian. I find it interesting that he's telling us what the Sumerians themselves wrote. You know, whether the Sumerians were correct or whether they were speaking in allegorical terms as opposed to literal terms, and, you know, all these other questions. It makes for some interesting discussion. And his collection of books are key to understanding the ancient astronaut theory, which I find astounding, the number of researchers that are happening onto this. And it just doesn't seem so far-fetched the more you read about this and hear the line of thinking and all the clues and the evidence. And certainly fundamental to this is the immense sophistication and knowledge of our ancient cultures. And so it gets you into a lot of very interesting areas. I think they should teach this stuff in school. I think high schools and colleges should be, okay, here's a bunch of interesting theories, classroom. Now you go out and find your own examination and therefore conclusion to some of the arguments that these people will present, and present a whole range of them. From the creationists to the Darwinian evolutionists to the ancient astronaut theorists, I think they should all be talked about and examined, because it's going to get you into history and linguistics and cultures and archaeology and geology and every other discipline, and you would get people with a real fervor for looking into these kinds of otherwise perhaps dry topics. It'll get you into mathematics and sacred geometry and everything. And I think it could be a whole reason to go back and hit the books and do some serious study so that you can begin to make up your own mind. What I've found is it's very hard to make up your mind one way or the other, and so I say, you know, it's all possible, and who knows? But I do know this, it's all fascinating, and you don't need to be in school to continue your studies, for heaven's sakes. I think life is a schoolroom, Earth is a schoolroom, and let's get to it. Now, picking up where the ancient astronauts left off, presumably ancient astronauts were in our distant past, our next guest suggests that the influence of these custodians can be measured in the recent past as well, and his research picks up where Sitchin's leaves off. Sorry, somebody was talking to me. Oh, by the way, a listener, they were just shoving a letter in front of me and wanted me to comment that a listener was recently writing to us that this show he found wonderfully optimistic, and I want to say thank you. But here now we're going to look at material that's not so optimistic. This is not a Pollyanna show. I happen to be an optimist, but for heaven's sakes, there's a lot of other points of view here. And our next guest is one who's having a little bit of a pessimistic point of view here about the woes of society and human nature here. But let me introduce him. William Bramley, author of The Gods of Eden, and his work is another fascinating line of a decade's worth of research into some very interesting questions. And he began by looking at the origins of war and finding some common threads, and then began to put some other pieces together. He says it bumps him up right to the UFO phenomenon, not a place he chooses to go, but a place that he had no way of avoiding. Bill, welcome to our show tonight.
Oh, thank you, Laura. It's a pleasure.
It's nice to have you here. Why don't we start in the beginning as you lay some groundwork here. I want our listeners to know, by the way, we have 2 hours to spend with Bill Bramley, and we're first going to allow him to lay out some of the line of his thinking, so then you can react to it and ask some questions and jazz on that. First, he needs to lay out his line of thinking, which is most interesting. But let's begin, Bill, in the beginning. As you began, you said that you were looking at the origins of war, and you recounted, in researching those origins, you noted the third-party factor, which had certain of its own motivations. War can be its own valuable commodity, you say. War can be an effective tool for maintaining social and political control over large population. And then your odyssey began with that.
That's right. Yeah, I was very interested in social history, and the problem of war was really foremost in my mind. So what I was really planning to do was just to do a historical treatise on third-party influences in war, meaning people who benefit from the existence of war, even though they're not actually directly involved with it. And some of the more obvious sources of that would be armaments manufacturers. They make money as long as somebody's fighting and using them. Banks which lend money to nations which fight wars. and that kind of thing. And I was really wanted to go back into history, maybe even go back to the old shield makers and so forth to see how far back this type of phenomenon goes and to see if there were any strings you could sort of connect them with just to get some idea of how important this factor has been in history. And what happened as I kept researching this, I eventually came up against various types of religious philosophy which seemed to inflame people into fighting wars. For example, certain types of apocalyptic beliefs are very often connected to religious beliefs, which causes people to go out and fight wars. And so I became kind of curious about that, and I was wondering, well, where did these come from? Then that led to a study of these various societies that were the foundation of these religious beliefs. You go back to ancient Egypt, you go back to ancient Mesopotamia, and then you ask, well, okay, who started these organizations? And then you get into this mythology of the flying gods. And that's where most historians just drop it. They just go ahead and treat that mythology as mythology. But as other people have pointed out, like your previous guest, Mr. Sitchin, that there may be something there in terms of an extraterrestrial race. So really all I did differently was I went ahead and took that possibility seriously, that maybe it isn't just a mythology, that there could be a real thing there. And that's what led me then into the UFO phenomenon. I wasn't planning to go there at all, but that's where I wound up. So it made for a very interesting study, I'll have to say that.
It certainly does, doesn't it? You recount a lot of known historical events in your book, Gods of Eden, and then you give a new twist to them. It's kind of a revisionist historical perspective based on a foundation in ancient astronauts. How do you make the leap between something that happened in our distant past, which, by the way, is much more comfortable to contemplate when it's dead and gone than when it's currently active here in the present or the very recent history? How do you make that leap? What were they doing all this time, and how do you know it's the same group?
Well, okay.
Or a related group?
Yeah, I could easily spend an hour talking about the evidence just on that one question, but I'll try to summarize it. What happened was when I finally got back to ancient Mesopotamia, the earliest civilizations, I ran into these flying gods and then the organizations that they were said to have created. You find these references in both Mesopotamian and especially in the Egyptian literature. Then what I did was I took these organizations and I followed their history from way back then and then going up to the present day. And what I found out is that these organizations are and have been very often the source of strife in the world, that they often breed the philosophies and the ideas that have continued to create wars. And, for example, we go through the Crusade period, we go in the revolutions of the 18th century, and then finally we even come up to some of the modern groups over in Europe today, which are the same kind of societies. And what I also found as I traced these organizations is that there continued to be a UFO connection to them, which was very surprising. One of the periods that I write about, for example, is the Black Death era, when these, for example, these societies were bringing about the formation of new religions, which eventually led to Protestantism. There was one group called the Friends of God. But anyway, these groups, of course, were then forming factions which were in opposition to other factions which already existed, and of course there was conflict that grew out of that. But what you found in the Black Death area is a heavy UFO period, and I have a lot of UFO reports in my book from that era, and a connection to that type of phenomena to these groups. So, I mean, it's kind of you have to take the evidence piece by piece and put it together. It's hard to do it verbally here, but what I try to do is, in a very understandable way, link these pieces of evidence together throughout my book all the way up to the modern day, and also document them and give sources for where I got that information.
And we'll continue with Bill Bramley, author of The Gods of Eden, when we come back. It's really a fascinating read, and it's available in paperback. And for a mere $6, you can really take a new look at our recent history. And I think that you're looking at it in a very dispassionate way and saying if you can step outside religious beliefs and step outside some of these fervently held belief systems that mankind has had throughout the ages and see what's the result of them, isn't that where you're coming from, Bill, that you find a whole new perspective on these things? So it's helpful to step outside of our own milieu for a moment and take a look at things from another perspective. We'll be right back. I'm Laura Lee. Hi, Laura Lee here on The Laura Lee Show, talking with William Bramley. It's Bramley, author of The Gods of Eden, which we are now offering. Call 1-800-243-1438. It's a fascinating read, and he's here for the next couple of hours to talk with us. When you look at the origins of war, and, you ask, everyone at some point asks this question, why aren't we getting it right on this world? I mean, what's wrong with us? I guess I can attribute all of our woes to just human nature and all of those, greed and fear and this, that, and the other. Why do we need to have an outside influence to blame?
Well, we don't really need to have an outside influence. It's just that the evidence seems to be there that there is one. And what I can maybe do is express it this way, is that when you look at the old Sumerian text and also the old Egyptian and even the biblical texts which derive from those, you find this idea that the old human, or the non-human gods, that is, who created Homo sapiens, they actually wanted to keep the human race in a state of subjugation. And I'm not sure if Mr. Sitchin got into that in the last hour.
We didn't have a lot of time with him.
Okay. So, but anyway, what the old Mesopotamian texts talk about is they talk about the creation of Homo sapiens as a genetic engineering experiment almost, but they were created for the purpose of being slaves, and that's what the old Mesopotamian texts say. What happened is that the Jewish tribes, when they left Mesopotamia, they took those stories with them and then created the Old Testament, where in the Bible story of Adam and Eve, you have the same concept expressed in symbolism, the idea that Adam and Eve, i.e. first human beings, were created to be servants. Now, one of the tools of controlling a large group of people was expressed by a man named Machiavelli, who wrote several hundred years ago, to express the idea that one way of controlling a population that you've subjugated in some way is you divide them into factions and have them fight one another. In other words, you create strife and conflict between them, because then what happens is that they're so busy attacking and pointing one another that they forget all about the person who is really out there and who has subjugated them. Anyway, Machiavelli is a very interesting read, and in fact, he's somebody who's assigned by college professors around the world still today, even hundreds of years after he was born. But so that is essentially what was expressed in some of these stories. You see expressions of that also in the biblical stories of the Hebrew tribes and their relationship with the Egyptian pharaoh. The idea that God, who prior to the writing of the Bible was said to be these many gods, who now we hypothesize are the extraterrestrials, that they wanted to create these factions and these frictions between people as a tool of control. And so I took that and then I addressed that issue and that theory to history going up till today to see how these groups that had their origins in these old ancient astronauts, that they have been the actual sources of conflict all the way up until today. And what's interesting is that the UFO phenomenon at the same time has kind of been hidden in the background, but it's been very consistent. For example, I'll be giving a slideshow here at the Expo in Seattle this next weekend, and you can see that the UFO phenomenon has been consistent in many of its facets from those ancient times up until the modern day. So what happens is we have this pattern that's been very consistent, in which we have the connection of UFOs to these wars and conflicts, which then goes to the old idea that initially we began as a subservient race, and that may be our status today. I don't know, I kind of covered a lot of ground there in a few sentences. We may need to maybe talk about each aspect individually.
One other source that you cite to indicate that man may be a subservient slave or something is Charles Fort, whose work has fascinated me. You might want to give us a brief history of Charles Fort and how he arrived at a similar conclusion based from a whole different line of reasoning.
Yeah, he's a wonderful author. He wrote several books in the early 1900s. His book called Book of the Damned, I think, was written in 1919. And what he did was he had a small inheritance, so he got very interested in just spending time researching reports of unusual phenomena of any kind back in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And he had all kinds of reports, things of falling out of the sky like frogs, unusual lights in the sky, UFO-type phenomena that were going on back then. But as a result of his research and looking into it, he concluded that essentially Earth is property, and he thought that we as human beings have the status of either livestock or slaves, in relationship to whoever these people are who are flying around in the skies. And I was very impressed with that idea because this was written back in 1919. We didn't have rocket ships back in those days. The idea of UFOs wasn't even widespread at that time. So I thought he was a very, very daring thinker, and his ideas have really persisted, at least in that regard.
Also, when we look at certain apocalyptic beliefs, you're connecting. I found this a very interesting line of reasoning. I've never run into this before until I met it up with in your book. You connect the apocalyptic beliefs that are there in the religious texts to apocalyptic beliefs that we ignore today, those coming from so-called alien abductees, or people that feel that they've had contact with aliens, and in conversation they're given these messages. And I found that rather fascinating to draw a parallel between them. One set we pay attention to in religious texts, the other set we ignore because they happen today and they're from UFOs.
That's right. Well, actually, some theorists think that the old apocalyptic beliefs are also from UFOs. One famous apocalypse is by Ezekiel, which is in the Old Testament. And that's one of the most quoted passages in the Bible by UFO researchers, where he talks about this bright, shining object in the sky that looks like brass. It's this flame coming out of one end. It lands, and out come these human-like creatures with what seems to be shields over their faces. And they take him aboard this object, and then they show him these so-called visions. They give him an apocalyptic belief then to go ahead and spread. Now, I also talk about the book of Revelation, which is at the end of the New Testament, which again is followed by Christians and people who follow that faith. There we have a similar thing where the person who was called Jesus was in a one-piece white suit. Now, some people might think it was just a robe, but then he had feet that were shiny as though he had some kind of metallic boots. And then the author of Revelation was taken up into heaven. In other words, somehow he went up into the air, either in a craft, which is what I speculate. But anyway, he was also given a ritual in which he was shown a lot of pictures which had all of these images, and that also resulted in probably the world's most famous apocalypse, which is the book of Revelation. And of course, that has affected a lot of people too. Now, what we see today in UFO abduction cases is some of these abductees are given similar images. For example, Betty Andreasson is very famous. She was given the image of the phoenix, which is an apocalyptic image in some religions. And then we have a lot of UFO abductees, too, who come back with some kind of similar message. It could be an environmental apocalypse. More typically, it's a religious type apocalypse. The only difference is that these new UFO abductees, they're not being added to the Bible, okay? The old UFO abductees, like Ezekiel and whoever wrote Revelation, well, they were added to the Bible, but that was thousands of years ago.
But you're missing mystical experiences in there. You're leaving no room for authentic mystical experiences when we can contact some other dimension of a higher order. So I want to know where that can fit into your thinking. We'll rejoin William Bramley. When we come back, I'm Laura Lee. And we're back. Hi, Laura Lee on The Laura Lee Show. Our guest, Bill Bramley, author of The Gods of Eden. Later on tonight, we're going to be talking about underground bases and tunnels. Bill's book, The Gods of Eden, recounts the influence of some covert societies. He said something to do, there's some connection there with UFO phenomenon, and its influence throughout history. Now, I guess my next question for you, Bill, is do you believe that true, authentic, mystical experiences can happen? I would agree with you that you can see the signs of covert activity and manipulation throughout our history. We're a gullible race, after all. But in my mind, that does not discount authentic experiences. You can have a lot of manipulation around true experiences, and you can thwart a lot of sincere events and happenings and beliefs. And there's all levels of manipulation to be had. At its core, though, do you think that they are actually authentic, or do you think that they were just placed in front of mankind as a means to an end?
Well, first of all, I think your comments are absolutely right. One of the key elements that I talk about in Gods of Eden is that there is a genuine spiritual reality, and that is certainly my belief, that the idea that we are actually souls inhabiting human bodies was an idea that was very common back then. For example, it was very common in the Greek religions. It was expressed by Plato. It was actually in the Bible, if you read the New Testament, that was actually the belief of the early Christians. And I'm convinced that that is the truth because of these near-death studies that a lot of people have done, and some very good responsible ones, which shows that there seems to be a consciousness, that our consciousness can leave the body. Usually it happens when a person's injured, or if they're on an operating table. We have many of these reports of people who leave their body and they look down on it, and they are not the body, they are the consciousness that is above it. And this, I think, is a very key element to analyzing the history of the human race, actually, because that was really the struggle. When you look at the old religious stories and the way that I analyze the Adam and Eve story, is the whole struggle is what is to happen to us as souls, meaning us as entities that occupy these bodies. And the battle, the way it was described by these older religions like the old Greek and the Gnostic, which is a reflection of many of the Greek ideas, is this idea that the conflict was between should the soul be free and be able to leave and enter the body at will, or should the soul be trapped in the body? And that's actually the concept that was used, the idea of being entrapped in the body, and that this was an activity of the custodial society by creating false religion that will, instead of lead to enlightenment, it's a religion that will lead to conflict. For example, let's say you tell somebody the way you're going to reach your salvation is if you go out and you attack this other person over there who follows a different religion. If you believe that, you may go out and do that thinking that that's going to set you free spiritually, and that has been a key element, I believe, in the manipulation. Therefore, because we are souls and because there's very good evidence of that, I think, yes, we definitely can have that type of experience that you're talking about. And in fact, I think not only is it possible, but that is part of the liberation of the soul, that the soul has perceptions and experiences that go well beyond the body.
Okay. We have some calls stacking up for you, but before we take them, I want to ask you one more question, and that is that you see it as a mixed bag. You have a whole chapter on the Freemasons and our Founding Fathers, which is quite fascinating research. I hope to get into it over the next time that we have with you tonight. And you say that some were great humanitarians. Most of them were great humanitarians, but again, you're also putting all these secret societies, the Freemasons being just one, into a rather negative light. Are they a mixed bag? And I was wanting to ask Zechariah Sitchin this as well. You know, on the one hand, these ancient astronauts gave us civilization according to these ancient texts. On the other hand, they were enslaving us. So, I mean, which is it? All of both? We can look around human nature and say, we've got good guys, we've got bad guys. Is the same true for them?
Yeah, I think so. I think when we deal with what I call the custodial society, which is that society which has custody of Earth, it's the same society that Charles Fort talked about. Yeah, I think they're just as diverse as we are. They have good people, they have bad people, and they have everybody in between. And just as on Earth, there are good people who try to do good things and bad people who don't do good things, and all the people who are kind of caught in the middle there. And I think that is also a situation here with these, what I call the custodians.
We also have good people trying to do good things that turn out badly for reasons not of their own fault.
Yeah, what I talk about, too, is the twisting of spiritual truth to create an oppressive situation. For example, if we have people who are guided by the truth or they want to follow the truth, then what you can do with them, unfortunately, is if you twist that truth just a little bit, you can make them do things that are really negative. For example, the example that I gave you about telling somebody the other side is bad and you need to go fight them and that's the way to your liberation. Mm-hmm. That idea, very good people may follow that because they don't know any better, and they're very sincere in believing that. So when I talk about groups like the Freemasons and so forth, what I'm really talking about is that most of them were very well-intended. In fact, you find some of the great humanitarians in these groups. The trouble is some of those truths that they followed were given just a little bit of a twist, so what they wound up getting involved with was fighting a lot of wars and generating that kind of conflict in the name of trying to attain a genuine salvation and a genuine enlightenment for the human race.
That is the nature of disinformation. You give some good information and then you put some bad information and mix it all together.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that's what's happened with spiritual knowledge.
Let's start with our phone calls and start with Justin calling from KXL Portland. Hi, Justin.
Hi, Laura Lee.
Go ahead.
Yes, hi.
Hi.
Yeah, I spoke to you a couple weeks ago when you were talking about Zechariah
Sitchin.
Right. And I think this is a totally fascinating conversation you guys are carrying on. I was going to ask the your guest,
Bill Bramley is his name.
right? If he would think that, I guess in religion they call it enlightenment, like Buddha was enlightened and Jesus was enlightened about certain religious and spiritual concepts. What would he think about the idea that maybe these guys were, I guess you could say, telepathically or some kind of communicated with or whatever by these civilizations, and they spread that religion, or that possibly these religious figures were actually from another planet themselves or aliens themselves?
Well, that's an interesting point. When you read the New Testament, you see a lot of phenomena that sounds almost UFO-like, like a lot of these angels. They were described as actually frightening looking. We just pick them now as being very angelic with the sweet features and so forth, but the Bible actually says they were very frightening. You look at the Star of Bethlehem and how it moved over to lead these wise men to the manger, and then it just stayed there suspended in the sky. In one of the apocryphal books, it says that the star then led these wise men back again. In other words, there was a high-tech aspect seemingly to it. So this idea of the Star of Bethlehem being a UFO, I think, has some credibility, especially when you look at some of the other phenomena that was attached to it. Now, the question is, okay, if there was a UFO connection, and I talk about that in my book in the chapter on Christianity, does that mean that Jesus himself was one of these aliens? That I don't know. I personally don't think so.
That's pretty far out.
Pardon me?
That's pretty far out.
Yeah, I don't personally believe it. I believe that there was some element, a UFO element, in that whole episode in history, but I don't think that Jesus himself was.
And anyway, Jesus has had such an impact, and we all have such a personal relationship, those of us growing up in this culture. How could a UFO being have that kind of an impact on us? It doesn't make sense.
Well,
yeah,
I think
but one thing you have to understand, too, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt here, but if you read the New Testament, after the four main Gospels that talk about Jesus' life, they talk about how there was an appearance of Jesus after the crucifixion, and initially nobody recognized him. So there was some kind of other second Jesus going on here. I don't really talk about this too much in my book, but I could talk about it now, is that there is some kind of second Jesus here which has a connection to this UFO type of phenomena when you read the New Testament. It's actually very fascinating reading. Like you read some of the writings that are attributed to Paul. He was the main apostle who wrote about these things and recorded them in the New Testament. So in that regard, yeah, there may have been a so-called second Jesus that may have had a closer connection to the UFO phenomena. But I don't know what that would be.
Some historians say the historical Jesus never existed. And some say, I mean, it's so wide open. Who can say? It happened so long ago. There's such sketchy pieces to work with. Who can say? Justin, anything else?
I just want to throw out one more thing. I guess in a cosmic or universal sense, if you could see alien civilizations as being like caretakers or even parents, in a sense. You know, when I was young, I thought my parents knew everything. They were like gods, you know what I'm saying? And when I got older, I realized that, hey, they were human just like me. And I think what might have happened is some of these people, some of these other civilizations may have taken advantage of our naivety as a civilization and made themselves out to be gods.
I think that's a very good point, and I talk about that too, that the idea of these being gods was something that I think they imposed on us because their technology was so far in advance and was so terrifying to the people who witnessed it that, yeah, people were just in awe of them. And the idea of them being parents, that's a good concept too. My idea here is that they just aren't very good parents. They're good parents and bad parents.
Oh, we should be used to dysfunctional parenting in societies, shouldn't we, by now?
Yeah, if we look at the UFOs as being parents, I think that we are talking about dysfunctional parenting here.
Well, I think when you're a parent and you let your children grow up, they become adults. You have to kind of let them go and fall and stumble and everything. And I think that's, maybe that's what they're doing. They're losing control.
Well, okay, that's an idea. In my book, I tend to think otherwise. I tend to think that the same types of manipulation that have been recorded are still going on.
Thank you.
Let's get to
that. Let's get to that in just a moment. Justin, thank you. Let's take our next caller, Brad. Hi, Brad. Hi, go ahead, Brad. Let's take a break then, and we'll come right back with William Bramley. By the way, we do have his book ready to ship out. If you would like a copy, call us at 1-800-243-1438. If you'd like to join us in conversation, that number to call, 1-800-800-5287. If you're in Canada or Western Washington, you can call us directly at 206-453-5287. I'm Laura Lee. Hi, Laura Lee here, and we are back on the Laura Lee Show. By the way, I want to again welcome our new stations, KDBS, 840 on the AM dial out of Eugene, Oregon, and KCNR. KCNR is 1320 on the AM dial, and they are located in Salt Lake City, Utah. That brings us up to 22 stations, some of whom will be joining us in a couple weeks hence. And, I just want to mention, one guest that we had on for a short time received over 400 inquiries when she was on, and I was thinking, gosh, we're now ready for other advertisers. We had a woman recently approach us about advertising Pignogenol, which is a supplement I take, and I thought, we're ready now. If you'd like to advertise a product, let people in this audience know about a certain item that's available and you have an 800 line, we're probably a pretty good source. You can contact our offices anytime. The 1-800-243-1438 is a good number to call all week long. We answer it when we're here, or we have a very nice, sophisticated voicemail system if you would like to leave a message, and we will certainly get back to you on that. You can also order our books, videos, and audio tapes on that number. And one of the books we're just adding is The Gods of Eden. We have William Bramley, the author, joining us, and we have lots of phone calls for you. And we've got a lot of questions, too. It's a very interesting theory that these custodial societies are still influencing us and are alive and well today. Next, we have Brad in Poulsbo, Washington. We did find you, I hope, Brad. Hi.
Hi. My question for Mr. Bramley is just exactly when did you start developing this, thesis that you have come up with here?
About a decade ago, wasn't it, Bill?
Yeah, actually a little bit longer. I started it about 3 years into the research. The vision started coming up there that maybe something like this was going on. So I had done about 3 years of research just into the different other aspects of it when the UFO aspect of it really came up.
You were a little disgruntled when you kept bumping into UFOs, weren't you?
Oh, yeah. I really didn't want to get into it. What happened was when I started seeing that these things were maybe important to what I was studying, I just pretty much gave up because I felt like nobody's going to read the book, and it's just getting a little bit too wild.
Welcome to 1995, huh?
Yeah, so I just didn't want to get into that. But what happened was I would maybe just be watching the news, or I'd be reading something else, and there would be something that I would see or read that would suddenly make things click in terms of what I had been researching it, and it just got me so intrigued again, I'd pick up the research again. So that's really how the book got finished.
Thank you, Brad. And next we have Alex calling in my hometown, Bellevue, Washington. Hi, Alex.
Hi, Laura. How are you this evening?
Good, thank you.
Yes. I have a thought for Bill. Hi, can you hear me?
Hi. Yeah, sure can.
Very good. I have your book, and I've read a good part of it, and along with Zachariah Sitchin's before you, and I have a thought for you. It seems to me that there's this discussion of, polytheism or monotheism. We tend to be generally in the thought of monotheism, but however, we can't account for other than through thoughts like yours and others that relate to the idea of, gods, but from a lower level, really. And what if the idea would be that our Creator gives us a vehicle for finding our way back to the original creation and sends it back an emissary periodically that doesn't really found a church per se, but just presents the real deep truth. And then when that person passes on, or that lineage of thinking sort of gets muddled over time, which yourself, when a group grows, it tends to be further and further from the center and further from the truth, like multiple witnesses to an accident.
All right.
We find then that is it possible that over a period of time the center core truth becomes lost and it becomes just a typical mass of controlled thinking for the purpose of maintaining then really a false hierarchy?
Yeah, that's a good point, because there's always been this dichotomy between the two types of religion that I talk about. You have the monotheistic type, I would call it monotheistic/apocalyptic, and then you have the personal development type of religion, which really deals more with people as individual souls and the route to their betterment. And there's always been an inherent tension between the two, and this latter type, the idea of the self-improvement type of religion, it does seem to come along every now and again, just as it's starting to die out. Now, how to explain that, I don't know. You may have an explanation there, but you're right. There does seem to be that pattern in history, which I would have to acknowledge.
Well, I appreciate that very much, and it does go along with something that I've been studying, and if you were interested in how I've arrived at my thinking, Laura has a way to access me, and I'm going to...
Actually, Alex, before you go, though,
yeah.
I have to tell our listeners, Alex joined us, was it last week?
Yes.
And you were telling us about George Adamski, someone who most of us write off because all the ufologists say, you know, the guy was a crackpot. And you made a very interesting case, which I'm still undecided about, but could you two discuss a case like Adamski, who had rather an apocalyptic message, didn't he?
Well, Bill,
didn't actually read his writings, but...
Do you know anything about Adamski, Bill?
I didn't study his case too much. I have to admit, at the time that I researched the gods of Eden, I pretty much accepted the UFO cases that most UFO researchers accepted, and Laura's correct that most UFO researchers have rejected his. So I have to admit I rejected it without really looking into it too much. I was so busy researching everything else, I really pretty much just took the UFO cases that most researchers seem to acknowledge.
But, you know, Alex, you were presenting the case that there was some basic religious message here that Adamski was referring to, and that at some point you're saying that these UFO beings and these ascended masters, as Adamski called them, were one and the same. And I'm going, well, why would an ascended being need a spaceship? It was one hurdle that, you know, I couldn't get over, but...
well, let me go back to Adamski's answer on that.
And then this is really, our guest is Bill, so we'll make this
Sure.
really brief and move on to the next call.
The idea is that you bring with you an entourage of support beings, because there's always a large job to do, not unlike Star Trek, if you will, with a prime directive to not really master an influence in a society other than through a consciousness of spiritual enlightenment, and that the vehicle serves really as a massive filing system and a means of controlling that which you need to transport from place to place. So far as consciousness on the higher higher levels being able to permeate any place at any time, the higher you go, the more that's possible, in my view, as we think of the Creator's consciousness and all our being an extension of that.
Thank you, then, for that. Appreciate the call, Alex. And we have David next, calling from KXL Portland. Hi, David.
Hi, this is David. I just wondered if your guest, Bill, could describe how he sees his vision differently than just strict biblical demonology. Paul talked about doctrines of demons that would corrupt religion, including the church, and even James talked about envy and strife. Where do they come? That wisdom is demonic. And I've heard various Christian writers talk about UFOs in terms of being explicable as angelic, fallen angelic entities and activities, since both angels fly, demons being fallen angels would fly. I just wondered what he might say.
What's your answer, Bill?
Okay, well, the New Testament, the writings of Paul, he talks about the demons being in the air, that the demons are of the sky, not under the earth. And that's repeated a couple of times. Now, what Paul and what the biblical writers really talk about is that they had a real conflict going on with people who were trying to change the type of Christianity that they were preaching. They had people coming in who were Jews, and they wanted to create a kind of Jewish type of Christianity where they still followed the Jewish laws, but they also believed in Christ. There was also a battle going on with the Gnostics, who had a different belief that the body was an evil place for the soul to be, whereas the Christians were teaching that it was more of a temple. Now, what they did to kind of knock out these beliefs and to make the believers not follow them was to say that the Jewish Christians and the Gnostic type of Christians were teachings of the devil, and therefore none of the followers should teach them. So to some extent, that idea was really an attempt to enforce the belief that Paul and the others were trying to convey, more than an actual, belief that there were actual demons invading Christians or invading the church at that time. Although I'm not sure if I got your question correct. I'm not sure if I answered exactly what you asked me there.
Well,
that's how I understand it.
We're bumping into the top of the hour, David, so you can rephrase that really quickly.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, I just think that there's a tension between weak gods who could provide, say, UFOs here and there, they're gone, and there's a strong God who can provide stars that are always present.
We are running out of time for the top of this hour. Let's spend another hour with Bill Bramley when we come back and your phone calls. Also, we're going to be talking about underground bases and tunnels with a gentleman who's done some extensive research into them.
Of the giant with long blonde or white hair and so forth. And then just one last statement. I have been to the Garden of Eden. If indeed you agree that if there was such a thing here, some believe that it was that it's Bahrain, just across from Saudi Arabia. And I'll listen to you now.
Thanks for that.
Okay, I'll have to remember the questions. If I forget, just go ahead and remind me. Regarding the lower and higher vibrations, yeah, I think that the society in our skies, that is the custodial society, technologically they're obviously much more advanced than we are, but I don't think that technological advance has necessarily led to a higher moral or ethical advance. If you look at human society, we've come a long way technologically, and yet we're still capable of as much barbarity as we were when we had much cruder implements. So
technological prowess does not lead necessarily to spiritual wisdom.
Exactly. And even if you have some technological type knowledge about the soul or the spirit, that doesn't mean that you necessarily use it in a beneficial way. So my speculation is that we're dealing with a society, again, good and bad people. Unfortunately, here on Earth, we may be dealing with an element of that society that is not really the one we'd want to deal with, and their ethical and moral values are not as high as we'd like to think, even though they may tell us that they're very high. That's a common message that UFO abductees get. But we don't necessarily have to believe somebody who says that, oh, I'm really good and I'm really great, if their other activities and their other acts and other evidence don't support that idea, which I think in this case they really don't entirely. And now getting on to your other question about the White Brotherhood, now did you say that that was in the Bible? Because I don't remember any mention of the White Brotherhood in the Bible.
Yes, where I got the information was from the I Am religion, if you're familiar with that.
Yeah, I talked about that in my book.
Yeah,
not in such favorable terms either.
Pardon?
Go ahead.
Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, I had thought that it was mentioned, and I can't remember what part of the Bible, and I can't remember. I think it was it giant beings with white hair? Does that ring a bell?
Oh, okay, yeah. I think what you're referring to is that the phrase "I am" is in the Bible.
Yeah.
And the I am movement there used that phrase, and I think also Elizabeth Clare Prophet, who has a group out in Montana, also uses I am as part of her teachings. So that is found in the Bible. Then there were giants mentioned in the Old Testament, the Nephilim, and I think, I don't know if Mr. Sitchin had a chance to talk.
Yes, he did.
Yeah, good, okay.
A mistranslation, he says.
Yeah. So now, they aren't really described, though, in the Bible. I think that is, they weren't described with any particular colored hair, but the idea that they were blonde and so forth, that's an idea that you find outside the Bible. In other words, other people...
Like Aryans, right?
Yeah, other people claim other evidence outside the Bible, but then they link it to this discussion of the Nephilim, which is in the Bible. Okay. So where that other evidence comes from as to the blonde hair and so forth, you have to go back into anthropology and so forth. And
I think your point is you need to tread carefully here, and just because someone uses a term and someone else uses a term doesn't mean they're co-equal or their message is the same or that it is necessarily an accurate representation of its source passage or all of this. I mean, all this stuff gets very knotted up and treacherous territory to try to wend your way through, wouldn't you?
Oh, yeah. You have to be real careful when you study this. When you read the sources, for example, somebody says, well, this is said in the Bible or in another source, you really need to go look it up, and that's certainly what I've learned. As much as possible, don't rely on second-hand sources if you don't need to. Go look up the original reference. You usually find that it's a little bit different than maybe what has been said sometimes. Anyway, that's just a general rule of research. Nobody would really be surprised at me saying that.
So, Bill, do you think that there is that there's actual tangible Garden of Eden here, and if so, do you believe it is in Bahrain, or as some claim?
Well, that's an interesting idea. Of course, most religious scholars think it was in the Tigris-Euphrates, which is where Iraq is right now. And Iraq and even Saddam Hussein, they put a lot of their national pride on the fact that the Garden of Eden was there. I think Mr. Sitchin, well, I better not say that because I'm not sure if he's the one, but somebody else also suggested it might have been in Africa. And Bahrain might be another choice. It's in that general area. So it's hard to say exactly where it was. I didn't really research that particular issue.
And a lot of people say it wasn't an actual place at all. It wasn't allegorical or meaning something else. Thank you, Mitch. Let's go on to Sid next. Hi, Sid. Thanks for joining us on the Laura Lee Show with William Bramley. Sid, tell you what, we'll take your call right after this break coming up, and we'll be back. You can join our conversation at 1-800-800-5287. I'm Laura Lee. And there it is. It's pretty hard to refute. Water erosion. Well, when was the last time torrential rains fell in the Sahara Desert? It was about 10,000 years ago, minimum. So they did have that little piece, but they didn't really go into it. It was just a little side note as they were introducing the connection to Egyptian symbols. Next, we have Chris calling in. Hi, Chris. Thanks for joining us on the Laura Lee Show with Bill Bramley.
Hi.
Hi.
I wanted to find out where like Homo habilis and Homo erectus fit into the framework of his theory, of Bill's theory.
Yeah, I talk about the sudden jump from early Homo sapiens to modern Homo sapiens. We're called Homo sapiens sapiens, and we arose about between 10 and 30,000 years ago. There was a sudden jump where the old Homo sapiens just vanished really off the face of the earth, and we appeared very suddenly. Now, of course, that was talked about as an evolutionary jump between people who believe in evolution. That's what they teach in the schools. But what you find in the old creation stories, and I hope Mr. Sitchin had a chance to get into it earlier, was the idea that the jump was caused by the intervention of an extraterrestrial race going about performing these experiments to create the slave race. Now, that seems to be far-fetched to our modern mind, but in fact that is the first creation story. When you read the old Sumerian text, that is what they said happened, even though we have a hard time maybe looking at it today. So that's essentially as far as I got into your question in my book.
Another comment I wanted to make, too, is the caller that called before about sort of questioning whether Jesus might have been an alien or something like that. One thing I thought was interesting, I've studied a lot of Russian iconography, and if you look at some of the pictures of baby Jesus, he's depicted in a very odd or strange sort of way that looks almost alien.
Uh-huh.
So I don't know if you've ever...
I haven't seen those. There's still a lot of information that I haven't gotten. If you have any photocopies or anything, you could send me. My address is in the back of the book, and I'd certainly be interested to get those. Yeah, the Russian Orthodox Church, they broke from the Roman Church, and so some of their beliefs are a little bit different, and you might find some interesting things in there that you won't find in some of the other Christian religions.
Thank you, Chris. And you should tell us the tale of Utnapishtim, which you relate early on in your book, and Sitchin talks about this as well, although we didn't get into it with them last hour. But I find that a fascinating recounting of the same basic storyline of Noah and the Ark, only this was much earlier in Sumerian texts.
Yeah, that's right. That was the story of a man who survived the flood, essentially. And it's very similar where he had a boat and he floated out there on the waters, and then he released the birds to find out if there was dry land. Now, what you find in the Old Testament stories like the flood and like Adam and Eve, they are actually based on old Sumerian stories that came before the Jewish religion was really established and before the Old Testament was written. Because if you read the Old Testament, you find out that the original Hebrew tribes lived in Samaria, and that's where they were actually founded. So when they left Samaria, they took a lot of those traditions with them. But what they did was, because they developed this one God idea, they took the same stories, but now instead of the many gods, which the Sumerians talked about, they now changed it to be the one God did these things. So what you find is that instead of the many gods of the old Sumerian stories creating the flood, and that's what they said, the Old Testament now says, well, it was just the one God that did it. But it does go back to those earlier stories.
The same storyline, only the place names and the characters' names change. We'll come back. We have another half hour to spend with Bill Bramley. You can join us also later on tonight. We're talking about underground tunnels and bases. This is the Laura Lee Show. That's one possible scenario, but Bill?
Yeah, okay, the connection between, like, the old American civilizations and the old world civilizations, well, there's a lot, and, for example, you see the pyramids down in Mexico, which are similar to pyramids over in Egypt. They mummified their bodies just like they did in Egypt. They had the same types of gods, the flying gods, as they did in Egypt. So, yeah, I see a very definite connection between the two, and I devote a little bit of time in my book to discussing that connection and the significance of it. On the subject of virgin birth, I talked about, for example, what Sitchin talked about, the idea of there having been a genetic manipulation and possible creation of Homo sapiens. I think if you look at the modern abduction evidence, for example, that Bud Hopkins has done, there has been this long-term fascination with playing with human reproduction. And I think that one interpretation of the virgin birth is simply that one of these high-tech angels, i.e. custodians, had artificially inseminated Mary, and that's what caused the birth of Jesus.
An alternative explanation.
Very alternative.
Very alternative. You point out something interesting, that the more a nation is inclined towards war, the more it will be dominated by sociopathic personalities, changing the topic completely, and Eric, thanks for your call. The more a nation is inclined towards war, the more it is dominated by sociopathic personalities, and that eventually brings the nation's downfall about. Could you explain that one? I thought that was a very interesting observation.
Yeah, what happens is when you gear up a nation or any group just for long-term warfare, most sociable people have a hard time being involved in that for any length of time. Usually the people who are engaged in chronic warfare, the people who can stomach it, are sociopathic people. And that's a sad fact of life. I mean, you look at the people who continuously create, they're out murdering, they're out doing things, like the gangsters and so forth. They're sociopaths, but they're the only people who really have the stomach to do it over a long period of time. So unfortunately what happens is when you have a government or any group that is fighting wars over and over again, those are the people that tend to be brought in because they're the ones that can plan it, they can carry it out, and they can do it over and over again. So you find people like that very often in the military, you find people like that in intelligence services especially, and that is unfortunately what happens. Now, that's not to say that everybody in the military is that way. Absolutely not. You find some very good, decent people in the military, but you also find, unfortunately, shoulder to shoulder to them, some people who are not that way. And
rather the opposite of the cream rising to the top.
Yeah, exactly. So usually when you find the societies that have the less sociopathic personalities, they tend to be the more peaceful ones, and they are also the ones that then they develop more of their arts, more of the things that we consider to be the higher elements in human activity.
Where would you classify the U.S. today when we can spend such an immense portion of our national budget on machines of death? I mean, where do you put us?
Yeah, well, somewhere in the middle. We're definitely not the highest level of society here. We're not the lowest either. There is still a fair amount of encouragement of people doing other things, but yeah, we do have.
It's a good place to live, all in all, when you compare it to other places on Earth today.
Yeah, exactly. We do have, unfortunately, a predisposition to go ahead and get involved in a lot of wars and a lot of covert activities through the intelligence activities of this country. And therefore, you will find that type of personality having positions in government of influence that, unfortunately, brings everybody to ruin. I mean, you look at what happens in wars while governments go into debt. The countries that fight them eventually suffer. We are suffering partly because of our history of warfare and the debt that has brought to us, and also in some ways in which our individual rights are kind of eroded a little bit in the name of fighting these different wars.
Now, that's what I really found fascinating about your book, was your recounting of the impact of war. You even say that the Federal Reserve itself had a history right there with the Founding Fathers. Some people think it was a later thing. I mean, I really had some eye-opening minutes here with your work in terms of some of these threads and the dynamics and the origins of war and how they can turn on individuals and individual events in history. Your revisionist history is just clear and concise on recent history, too. It was just fascinating.
Yeah, thank you.
Next, Laura in Spokane, Washington, listening to KGA. Hi, Laura.
Hi. I was just wanting to thank Bill for writing the book. He was, after me and my husband read that book, we made a decision to withdraw from organized religion and sort of start expanding our awareness, and I really appreciate that. One question I want to ask him, after he wrote the hardcover, it was almost impossible. It was out of print for a while, and we kept writing to the publisher. We kept writing to every place we could think of to get more copies of the book, and we couldn't find them anywhere, and we were afraid that he dropped off the face of the earth or something. And so I'm just wondering what happened at that time.
You mean between the hardcover and the paperback?
Right. Uh-huh.
Well, not much. What happened was that the hardcover sold out, and Avon had approached me and the hardcover publisher about doing a paperback, but there was a delay, or there was a gap between the selling out of the hardcover and then the release of the paperback. It's just the time that it takes to release a paperback.
Okay,
but the decision was made not to reprint the hardcover because the paperback was coming out. So there was a period there where the book was simply not available.
Well, not only that, but every place we called, the number had been disconnected. And I was real worried about it at that time.
Oh, yeah, no, I'm doing just
alive
fine.
and well.
I appreciate your concern. I really do.
And we have the paperback here. If you can't find it, Laura, we have a good supply of them. So call us
could you
at
give that number again, please?
1-800-243-1438. And we have not one, but two people there to answer calls right here at the number, Marilyn and Ben. 1-800-243-1438. Got lots of copies of this book. It's a fascinating read. We'll come back with Bill Bramley and the rest of your phone calls just after this. I'm Laura Lee.
And some people seem to remember a little bit here and there. But that idea, I tend to trust that idea based upon the near-death studies that I've seen. So this is just my analysis of it, is that because there is an amnesia process, which I think is very unhealthy, and in this regard, I kind of follow the teachings of, the old Greeks, the idea that, it's a process of spiritual deterioration that we forget. Because what happens as souls, and we have to learn everything over again. We have to learn how to talk, we have to learn how to read again, and by the time we've learned everything, we die again, and then we have to start over. So the being of light is connected in some way with this interim period between lives. And my guess is that it has something to do with the amnesia process, which I believe is unhealthy. So that's why I do not believe that spirit or that being of light is a supreme being or a god. Now that's just my view on it. I know that there are other views.
Thank you, Len. And thanks for your support of the show, by the way. Next we have Dune calling in. Love that name. Hi, Dune.
Oh, good evening, Laura Lee, and good evening, Bill. I have a question. Lately this year, there was some manuscript tablets found, I believe, in Peru that had detailed inscriptions on them of intricate heart operations, like telescopes or microscopes coming from people's eye, humanoid figures that were actually around dinosaurs. Have you heard anything of this, or have you... Personally, have you heard anything about this?
No, I haven't, and that sounds fascinating. If you have any articles or anything, I'd certainly welcome them. I don't know about that.
Yeah, I've been trying to find these documents also. I heard it either it was from Laura Lee's program or on Susan Howe, I believe, was saying something on this. Did you hear anything on this, Laura?
I heard something about now they can verify that they had some surgery techniques, and it had something to do with brain surgery and also very delicate surgery. I can't remember where. We've also heard about stones that were showing figures of humans and dinosaurs, so they would surmise living in the same age.
Right.
So some other stuff, something to pursue, definitely.
Yeah, it is well known that they did do brain surgery. They found plenty of skulls with the surgery done, the holes in the skull. But I didn't know anything about microscopes or anything having to do with actual high-tech instrumentation, which would be very interesting if that were true.
Yeah, that's what I was.
We have about a minute to go, so we need to wrap up.
Okay, yeah, just real quickly. I found that quite interesting that the humanoids had that were depicted on these tablets had that technology, and these tablets, as far as I can reckon, they were found just this year in Peru.
Oh, I see.
Interesting. Well, thank you for that note, and I'm going to give the last minute to Bill to conclude for us. This has been a very nice visit. Thank you so much for your time. I know how busy your life is. And what would you like to say by way of conclusion here, Bill?
Well, I encourage people, like you said, to do research, and that was one of the things that I tried to do at the end of the book, is one person can't do it all alone, and the more people who participate and do their own research and writing, I think the better. I think there's a lot here for us to learn and to know, and I encourage as many people as possible to get involved very actively in it. And I want to thank you for being a wonderful host. I really enjoyed it. You have wonderful listeners. It was really quite a pleasure being on the show.
You know what's amazing to me is that you can put some interesting theories forward, and we didn't have a single call, somebody calling up and say, hey, you guys, you're crazy. Where were those calls? I want to know. But everyone, it seems like, is pursuing these very interesting lines of thinking and going out there outside our comfort zones and into some very challenging and intellectually daring territory. That was Bill Bramley. Jim, we've got his book, The Gods of Eden. Thanks so much. When we come back, we'll be talking about underground tunnels and bases. Don't miss it.